Johnny's heart sank, then twitched his neck, eliciting a series of cracks, then added, I mean, some rags and such, but nothing else. Johnny's heart leapt right back again. Rags? You leave those there? Ben asked. Yeah, well, there was one piece of cloth I had, Johnny said. It was pretty big. I thought I brought it home, but I suppose I might have left it. Yeah, I recall wrapping the battery up in something like that to transport it here. Is it at your place too? With the battery and the wires? Nah, Ben said. It was filthy, so I tossed it in the cleaning bin here at school. It's important to you? Another surge of adrenaline. Sort of. I mean, it belonged to my Grandpa Jackson. Where's the bin? I'll go get it. It's emptied every Saturday. A woman comes by and sifts through it to decide what to clean and what to, well, burn. Burn! Johnny's adrenaline turned to alarm. Is it possible she didn't pick it up yet? Ben stood. I suppose it's possible, but she's pretty prompt. Johnny moved restlessly in his stool. Ben smiled curiously and said, I can see we ain't gone get nothing done till we go look for that rag. He sighed. Come on, the bin's out back. The three braved the cold and went outside to look. When Ben opened the container, empty! Johnny said. At that moment, he felt every ounce of joy pouring out of his soul. Ben lowered the lid. Sorry about that. If I'd have known, I would have held onto it for you. Wait, Johnny said. Maybe she didn't burn it. Maybe she just cleaned it. It was a mess. It was a right mess, Ben cautioned. It's worth asking. Do you know who the cleaning woman is? Johnny asked. Ben scratched at his gray-flecked whiskers. I believe her name is Annie. No, Ari. That's it. Johnny's eyes widened. The waitress at Hoop's Diner? Yeah, that's the one. You know her? She dropped off some food for us a few days ago. She seems nice. She seems nice enough, Ben said, rubbing his hands together. Now, we best get back to work. My bones don't care much for this cold weather. On the way back in, Emmy said, If you're going to Hoops after school, I'll come along. You can get your grandpa's cloth, and I can get a chocolate soda. Chapter 9. No sooner had school been dismissed than Johnny and Emmy darted out of the building for Hoop's Diner. Johnny walked briskly, saying nothing. He was sorting through the options of what he might find out about the cloth. He dismissed the ones with dire conclusions, and he feared that the positive ones wouldn't come true. I've never seen you so eager to leave school before, Emmy said. Oh, you know, that pill Laszlo glowering at me all day long. I just got one black eye healed up. I decided to scram before he could try giving me another one. Emmy frowned. I thought boys considered black eyes a badge of honor. And I thought girls were supposed to moon over boys who were hurt.
Not hardly,
she smirked. A few minutes later, they entered Hoop's Diner, and the door opened with the tingle of the shopkeeper's bell. Behind the long sit-down counter, Thomas, the owner, waved at them as he finished an order. They walked down the length of the narrow building and sat in a booth at the end. One of the few diners in North Carolina. Hoops had opened just before the Depression hit. It was an instant success. A wealthy family with a distrust of banks started the venture, and because they offered affordable meals, Hoop survived while the other restaurants shut their doors. In the last few months, business had even increased, so much so they needed to hire on a few extra people. Johnny craned his neck in every direction. At one point, it raised up like a periscope as he peered over a few customers.
"Do you see her?"
Emmy asked. "Not yet," Johnny said, still looking. "Maybe she's back in the kitchen." He plucked a menu from behind the ketchup bottle and looked it over while he was waiting.
"So,"
Emmy began gingerly,
"what's the big deal with the cloth? I mean, I know it was your grandpa's, but I've seen your trunk. You have a lot of stuff in it. What makes an old piece of cloth so special?"
Johnny would have loved to tell Emmy the whole story, but his father had instructed him to keep quiet, and it made sense. The more people who knew about the cloth and what it could do, the greater chance it could fall into the wrong hands. But right now, he hoped Ari still had it in her hands. If it had been burned as rubbish, its secret and history would be lost forever. "I think I'll have an RC Cola," he replied. "You?"
"I'd like an answer, and then a chocolate soda."
Johnny evaded. "It's a family heirloom. Why wouldn't it be important to me?" He needed a change of subject, and then suddenly thought of one. "Oh, by the way, I saw Steve a few days ago. Did you know he could draw? I mean, really well."
"No, I didn't."
"He's sketching some nifty-looking Christmas cards. He wants to sell them to help pay for some of his medical bills. I told him I'd hawk as many as I could. You want to help?"
"Sure. But how?"
"We can go door to door. Once people see the cards and know they're for a good cause, they should sell easily."
"Maybe," she said, chewing on her lip. "But I wonder if..."
Her eyes darted back and forth as if watching some unseen event. Then her face lit up and she bounced forward in her seat.
"I have a great idea. We sell the cards at the school play. Tiny Tim is kind of like Steve. Even the Scrooges in the audience will want to help out, I bet."
Johnny smiled. "But will Principal Ambrose let us? The fundraiser's for the school, not for Steve."
Emmy bounced in her seat. "But maybe it should be. I mean, I know the school needs the money, but Steve needs it more, right?" Look, my dad and Principal Ambrose are old friends. You take care of the cards, I'll take care of the principal.
Deal.
Johnny agreed. A voice from the booth opposite them said,
Sounds like you two are on a mission. It was Al. Emmy beamed at him.
Oh, hi! We didn't see you.
I like to blend in, he said. He nodded at Johnny. Hi, champ. Say, that eye looks great now. For a while there, you could have been doubled for Lon Chaney in the Phantom of the Opera.
You want to join us?
Emmy said quickly. Johnny reasoned if Al joined them, Emmy would be distracted from asking about the cloth. So despite his mistrust of the guy, he said as pleased as he could, Yeah, please do. Sure. Al slid out of the booth and plopped next to Johnny. He nudged him. So, I know Emmy said you two aren't an atom, but what do you say? I don't have time for a girl in my life, Johnny said. It was a line he heard out of a movie once, and always wanted to try out.
Well, I'm a girl,
Emmy reminded him, as if he needed it.
You seem to have time for me.
He could see she was vexed when her chin tucked and her eyes narrowed. It was a surefire giveaway. The sarcasm in her tone was a solid clue as well. Of course I do, he clarified. But as like a friend, like you said. Good save, he thought. Al suppressed a smug grin. The kind adults show when they think kids are so cute. He said, Well, maybe you two brands could help me with something.
How could we help you? Emmy asked.
I'm looking for a good, healthy bank where my aunt can keep her money. Someplace safe. She lost a lot when the banks crashed and is just now digging out. Wants to make sure she doesn't lose it all. He smiled innocently. Johnny tucked the menu back behind the ketchup. There's only one in town, Barrymore Banking and Trust.
But I'm sure it's safe, Emmy volunteered.
Oh, why's that?
Johnny and I found some Confederate gold, and that's where it's being kept.
The words shot out of her mouth before Johnny could stifle her. Why he felt the need to do so, he couldn't say. But since the moment he met Mal, he had a nagging feeling that the man wasn't who he said he was. Maybe it was the scar on his forehead that unnerved Johnny, or that he had just asked two kids about which bank to use. Whatever it was, Johnny felt sure he'd assessed Al correctly when the man didn't even bat an eye at Emmy's mention of the gold. It was as if he had already known about it. Gold, eh? Al said. You two treasure hunters?
More like detectives. Emmy volunteered. Johnny's the brain. He's a regular Sherlock Holmes. I call him that sometimes. Sherlock.
You used to, Johnny pointed out. He shot a look at Al. I don't much like the name.
Al chuckled. Amiably, maybe? How do you know the gold's still there? In the bank. I mean, they might have moved it by now. I saw Mr. Underwood last week. He's the bank manager, Emmy said. He told me it's locked up tight. He said the vault's the safest place for it. Al leaned in. And why's that? At that moment, Ari walked up and asked, What'll it be? Then, seeing Johnny, she added, Oh, you're the Whitaker boy, aren't you?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the food. It was really good. At least the stuff that didn't end up on the floor.
I'm glad. How's your ma? Any better?
Actually, she's doing much better. Weirdly enough, he thought, and then added, Thanks for asking.
Ari laid her calloused hand on Johnny's shoulder. Keep your head up. The sun don't go down, but that it comes back up again soon enough now. She pulled her order booklet from her apron pocket. Name your poison. Johnny and Emmy put in their order. Ari asked Al if he wanted anything else. Nope. Need to go. He responded, and as quickly as he said it, he stood up. Nodded at Johnny, winked at Emmy, and left the diner without even a backward glance. Here's your hat. What's your hurry? Ari called after him. Johnny glanced at Emmy. He needed to ask Ari about the cloth, though he knew it meant Emmy would probably start asking questions again. It couldn't be helped. He took a breath. Mrs. Ari, I'm sorry, I don't know your last name. Beard. It's an awful last name, and I shy away from it, but I just go by Miss Ari. Not married anymore. My husband died, rest his soul.
I'm sorry,
Johnny said. So am I. All he left me was his last name. Miss Ari, Emmy interjected. Mr. Huck at school said you take care of sorting through their cleaning bin. Sure do, said Ari. I clean what can be and burn the remainder. No rest for the weary. The money helps out my folks back at home in Missouri. Why?
An old family heirloom got put in there by mistake, Johnny said.
Ari tousled her black hair. Oh dear, I hope not. What's it look like?
It's, well, pretty plain looking. No particular markings. It's old, really old, and kind of long and white. He wasn't used to describing the cloth.
I know that cloth. Everything else in the bin was pretty small, but that one was big enough to cover a table. And it looked like something my mama would have weaved.
You didn't burn it, did you? Johnny asked abruptly.
Ari gave Johnny a wink and a smile. I didn't. Haven't even washed it yet.
Dizzy with excitement, Johnny asked, Is it here? Can I have it now?
Ari chuckled. Afraid not.
not in the habit of bringing laundry to the diner, but you can pick it up at my house. Great! When do you get off work? Oh, it can't be today, honey. I'm working late and leaving town right after. Got my bag packed and waiting in the back. Johnny's joy deflated. Leaving? How long will you be gone? Ari grimaced. Till next Wednesday. A whole week? She nodded. Afraid so. Unavoidable. She patted Johnny's hand. Don't worry, hon. Your cloth won't walk off. It did a few days ago, he thought. Ari wrote directions to her house on a notepad, tore off the page, and handed it to him. Here you go. You come by my place after school next Wednesday, and I'll have it all ready for you. And she shoved her pad into her pocket. 1 chocolate soda and 1 RC cola. Coming up. She shuffled away. Emmy smiled at Johnny. That should make you happy. Yeah, I'd have hated to lose it. Johnny tried playing it cool. He was ecstatic at the promise of getting it back, even though it would be a week of torturous waiting. They listened for a minute to Bing Crosby singing, Silent Night, from the radio behind the counter. At least Johnny listened to it. Emmy seemed to wander off in thought. Once the song ended, Johnny said, Bing is the best. Why do you suppose Al ran off like that? Emmy asked. I don't know. I really don't trust him, though. What do you mean you don't trust him? She said, with more than a hint of frost. Oh, come on, Emmy. Think about it. A guy nobody knows with a mysterious relative he won't name comes to town, and the first thing he asks us about is a bank? And then, when you tell him the gold is there, the only reaction he has is to say it may have been moved by now? Why would he say all that? The only reason I can think of is because he already knew how long it had been there. Emmy's frosty demeanor turned glacier. Oh, brother. And how would he even know about the gold until I told him? Now it was Johnny's turn to be annoyed. Every newspaper in the eastern seaboard picked up that story. He'd have to been living in a cave not to hear about it. Emmy heaved a long sigh and snatched a napkin out of the dispenser. You see a mystery lurking in every corner, don't you? No, but I do keep my eyes open, Johnny answered, a bit too defensively. You should try it sometime. Well, that's a fine thing to say, she shrieked. Several customers craned their necks to look at them. Johnny noticed, but didn't care. Why are you being such a girl? Emmy's olive complexion turned maroon, which perplexed Johnny since he always thought of olives as being green, and everyone knows that green and red make yellow. His mental diversion was interrupted when Emmy huffed loudly, tossed her napkin on the table, and stormed out of the diner. As much as he liked her, Johnny knew at that moment that there were times he didn't understand Emmy at all. One thing for certain, she wouldn't practice that stage kiss again anytime soon. Ari walked up and set 2 drinks in front of them. 1 chocolate soda, 1 RC cola. Something tells me you'll be drinking both. You heard that, huh? Everyone on the block heard that, Ari said. Johnny slurped a huge gulp of the soda, still wondering how things went off the rails so quickly. Want some pie, hun? Pie makes everything better. No thanks, Johnny answered. Though pie did sound good. Mind me asking what that argument was about? Had me a daughter once. I might be able to shed a little light on things for you. Once? Johnny asked. Did something happen to her? Cholera. Terrible disease. She was just starting her laugh out. Tain't right. I'm sorry. I have a friend who's really sick too. We're doing a school play as a fundraiser for his medical bills and selling Christmas cards he drew. Put me down for a dozen. And tickets to your play. When is it? The evening of the 22nd. I'm pretty sure the whole town will show up for it. I expect so. I ain't been here long, but this seems like a community of caring folks. I'll be thinking of your friend. What's his name? Steve Mangle. He has muscular dystrophy. I've heard of that. Nasty, awful disease. A child shouldn't have to go through such things, she said, her eyes tinged with sorrow. I'll do my part to get word out about the play. Won't be hard in a town as small as Providence. Now, what were you and the young lady quarreling about? I have no idea, Johnny said, his face resting in his hands. We started talking about the guy who was sitting with us. I told her he seemed kind of shady to me. And before I knew it, she got angry and left. Ari sat opposite to Johnny in the booth. If it helps, I'm with you. That feller's a real no-good Nick, she said. You know Al? Al? That ain't what I heard him call himself. What, when? Not an hour ago. He was sitting over there chatting it up with some gents in Spiffy Duds, talking some Fowler about a case of something. Johnny sat straight up, his detective antenna on high alert. Did he maybe say he was casing something like checking it out, like the bank? There's been talk of gangs robbing banks in these small towns. Ari looked surprised. Is there? Maybe I should get my money out, though I'm not sure where I could keep it if I did. Then she cocked her head and said, You know, it seems like I did hear something, them talking about the bank. Not that I eavesdrop, mind you. You hear plenty of things on this job, but I try to keep my nose out of other folks' business. Still, there's something fishy about that guy. Johnny rewound the conversation a little way in his mind. You said Al was going by other names? Ari thought for a few seconds. Yeah, Sam or Ham. I can't say for sure. The door jingled, and an elderly man and his wife entered. Grab a seat anywhere, Ari called out. Be right with you. She stood up and straightened her apron. Now, you go make things right with your girlfriend. She's a sweet thing. Johnny's eyebrows converted. She's not my... Not your girlfriend? Right. Listen, maybe you feel that way, but one thing's for certain. She don't. It's as easy as pie to see. Speaking of which, let me know if you change your mind. Johnny took a deep breath. Good grief. Emmy wants to be my girlfriend? He planted his eyebrows on the tabletop and propped up his head in his hands. One more thing to think about. Emmy? Al? The gold? The bank? The play? Laszlo? Steve? Paul? The mysterious boy? Fiona? The cloth? Miss Ari! He called out. I think I will have some pie after all. You have the money for that, boy? Chapter 10. Johnny left the diner a half hour later, his stomach full of pie, cola, and soda, and his mind full of complex thoughts. If only life consisted of math problems or science formulas. He knew how to solve those. Relationships were a lot harder. He had, however, settled on his course of action to fix his mind resolutely on getting the cloth back and give Fiona the best Christmas present ever. His resolve lasted almost a full minute. It was snowing. Again. He turned his face skyward and let the icy flakes dust his face. He closed his eyes and stuck out his finger for the flakes to land on, and then heard a sharp tsk. He slowly opened one eye and then the other. Standing in front of him was an elderly woman, her pug-like brow wrinkled up in layers. He quickly retracted his tongue, nodded to her, and said, "Hello." She glared at him, snorted, and continued on, shaking her head and muttering, "Young people these days." Johnny sighed. At times he felt like a misfit, the only plaid in a world full of polka dots. But then, again, maybe that wasn't so bad. He glanced back at the old woman, stifled a chuckle, and headed down the sidewalk. At the corner, he jaywalked across Main Street. He passed several businesses, including Howard's Barbershop and the Five and Dime. Then he saw the light in the bank. He stopped. After hearing the curious things Ari had said about Al, he decided the bank should be told. Johnny went inside. Mr. Underwood, the bank manager, looked up from his desk behind the counter. A K. Woody Chesterfield pipe hanging from his teeth. The scent of cherry tobacco wafted through the room. "Well, good day, young man." Underwood set the pipe on the wooden tray atop his desk. "And how's our young celebrity this fine afternoon?" "Fine, sir. Thank you. May I ask you a few questions?" Underwood smiled wisdomly. "I'm not in trouble, am I? A detective such as yourself can come across as somewhat intimidating." Johnny returned the smile as he made his way through the gate in the corner. "No, sir, I just was wondering." Mr. Edward leaned forward, his hands folded as if in a prayer. "Excuse me." "Have a seat," he said. more as a directive than a suggestion. Johnny pulled out the wooden chair and sat in it. "Thank you. Now, what can I answer for you?" he said intently, but with a pattern of amusement, as if he were entertained by Johnny's request. "Sure, sir, have you ever come across a man, he's new in town, by the name of Al?" Johnny could see Underwood mentally sorting through a catalog of faces he had encountered that week. His eyes darted left and right as if images scrolled across his vision. Soon the light of recognition appeared on his face. Tall, slender fellow, dark hair salted with gray, sporting a mustache like a hairy caterpillar. "That's him. Shady looking." Underwood grinned. "I thought he was rather dashing myself, and cordial." He cocked his bald head. "You don't like the man?" "No, I mean, it's not that I don't like him. I just thought he, looked shady." "Yeah." "Why do you ask about this shady character? Is he in trouble?" "I don't know. I guess I'm suspicious of new people coming to town right after we discover a lot of gold. Plus, he was overheard talking to another man about the bank, something about casing it." Mr. Underwood harumphed, nodded, picked up his pipe, leaned back in his chair, and puffed intently. "I don't know there's much to worry about, my boy. Our bank here is very secure." "But did he ask you anything about the bank? Maybe its security?" Mr. Underwood puffed harder. "I know it sets a young boy's mind in motion. Bank robberies and whatnot. And your mind's a keen one, no doubt. But here's the thing. Bonnie and Clyde are their names. Bonnie and Clyde and their kind are a thing of the past. A few renegades are still on the prowl. To be sure, but J. Edgar Hoover and his sort are rounding them up. It's just a matter of time before every one of these hooligans are finished. So put your mind at ease, young man. There's nothing to worry about." "I'm not worried, sir. I just think it's smart to get ahead of the trouble if you can." Underwood smiled appreciatively. "You may be right, though in my army days I learned an important truth. If you get too far ahead of your company, your own men may mistake you for the enemy." Excuse me again. Johnny considered the axiom and then said, "I suppose. But I think I'll figure it out if you're all shooting in the same direction." "Fair enough." Underwood drew his pipe on his pipe again and exhaled a cloud of smoke that wafted around his head. "Though I'm not sure what more we can do here, security-wise." Johnny suddenly had a brainstorm. "How about an alarm?" he said eagerly. "Something that would go off if a robber tried to break in." Underwood removed his pipe from his mouth thoughtfully. "Interesting. And I know where you can get one. Right here in Providence. From the school." Underwood looked confused. Johnny plowed on. "Not the school, exactly, but someone in the school. Ben Huck." Underwood blinked. The janitor? Yes, he's a brilliant inventor. He's already made the system, and it works like a charm. He created it as a fire alarm, but it could easily adapt for the bank. He could even make it so that if a robbery occurs, it would alert the sheriff's station. Providence does have one of those, he thought. Really? Underwood contemplated the possibility. Could he rig it with a panic button under my desk like those fancy town banks have? He could rig a button under every teller window if you want. Underwood slapped his hand on the table and pointed his pipe at Johnny. This is very impressive. I'll tell you what, young Whitaker, you have Huck bring his system and demonstrate it for me. If it works like you say, the price is right, I'll buy it from him. Deal? He stood and held out his hand. Johnny also stood and took it. Deal. They stood. Underwood returned his pipe to his teeth. You're quite the savant, I must say, he said with a puff and a grin. I'd better watch out for you, and you'll have my job someday. Nah, I'd like to do something more exciting than this. Underwood smiled and said, I can't say I blame you, my boy. There are days when I feel the same way. Chapter 11. Johnny awoke with a start. His internal clock told him he had overslept. His internal clock was right. He heard a chime of the mantel clock in the living room downstairs. He was a full half hour behind schedule. He jumped out of bed as if there were a fire. It had been a short night, thinking about Al or Sam or whatever his name was, and the plans he might have to rob the bank, which would be a big gang wearing handkerchief masks, or an overnight theft while the town slept. His imagination scored every possibility. After scarfing down his breakfast, Johnny patted Macduff, ignored Charlie, and kissed Fiona, then grabbed his knapsack and lunch pail. He bolted out the door into the cold winter morning. He jogged over to Emmy's house, half expecting her to be outside already. As there was no sign of her, he stood on the sidewalk, waiting. He rehearsed his apology to her for the argument they'd had at the diner, all the while wishing she'd hurry so they wouldn't be tardy for class. After a few minutes, he went up to the door and knocked. Mrs. Carpello answered. Buongiorno, Johnny, she said cheerfully. Mrs. Carpello was known about town as a person who broadcasts waves of smiles in every sea of crowns. Morning, Mrs. C. Is Emmy ready for school? Oh, I'm sorry. She left early. Her eyebrows danced expressively as she spoke. I know that's usual for her, but she seemed pretty excited, and I'm not a one to curb my Bambita's enthusiasm for learning. Right. Well, thanks. Prickle. You're welcome. Please give my love to your mama. Yes, ma'am. Even the door sounded cheerful when she closed it. Johnny made his way toward school. He pondered why Emmy would leave early. His first thought was that she did to avoid him after their quarrel, but he decided not to assume the worst, that That thought soon changed, though. Standing in almost the exact spot of his eye, blackened wallop of Laszlo from Laszlo were standing in almost the exact spot of his eye, blackened wallop from Laszlo were Emmy and Al. They seemed to be engaged in a deep conversation. Emmy's hands gesticulated wildly, which she only did when she was describing things. That she did it now concerned Johnny. Was he pumping her for more information about the bank? At one point, Emmy laughed like a silly schoolgirl. Of course, she was a schoolgirl, but he'd never thought of her as a silly one. Johnny thought back to something he'd read in a detective novel. A person's attributes typify the true person within. Johnny studied Al's attributes in addition to his eyes being too close together. His teeth were crooked, and his mustache was even more crooked. How could you trust that guy? Johnny started toward them. No sooner had he done so than Al turned and sauntered off. Emmy stood to pick up her bag and glanced Johnny's way. When she saw him, her demeanor instantly changed, and she quickly began walking towards school. "Emmy, wait up!" Johnny called. They were almost in front of the school before he caught up to her. "What's your hurry?"
"We're late for class."
"You didn't seem to mind until I got here," she frowned.
"When did you get to be such a serious person?"
"I was born that way, remember?" Her pace increased. Johnny grabbed her arm. "Emmy, stop a minute." She pulled her arm free and kept on.
"Don't do that!"
Johnny jumped in front of her and forcing her to stop. "What's going on? Why didn't you wait for me this morning?"
"What's your problem? You've been known to leave without me. Why is it a crime if I do so?"
"It's not a crime. I just want to know why you're avoiding me."
"I'm not avoiding you."
Johnny scoffed. "What do you call this foot race we've been running? I half expect you to break into a gallop."
"Oh, so now I'm a horse?" "Thank you for your high opinion of me."
"No, Emmy. Listen." He took a deep breath. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry about our argument at the diner yesterday. I'm sorry I grabbed your arm. I'm sorry about asking so many questions. And I don't think you're a horse. Though I'm very fond of them myself. There. Now can we talk?" Her nose poked into the air.
"If you had anything interesting to say, I'd be happy to talk. But since you don't, I'll just have to keep avoiding you. Excuse me."
With that, she bounded up the school steps and thrust herself inside. Flustered, Johnny stood at the stoop as dozens of kids filed past him. Something was definitely going on between Emmy and Al. Was he grilling her for the lowdown on the Confederate gold? Did he think she had some ownership in it? Or perhaps that she could get him access to it? Whatever he was up to, Johnny smelled a rat. And that made him increasingly concerned for Emmy. The bell rang, and Johnny climbed the steps when a hard shove from behind sent him sprawling onto the landing. His knees slammed into the concrete, tearing open his trousers and his skin. Needle poke pains shot through him. He wanted to cry out, but held it back and grimaced instead. "You need to watch where you're going, Johnny boy." Johnny looked up to see Laszlo Farnsworth towering over him. "You look pretty clumsy," Laszlo chided, a cruel smirk on his face. "You gonna cry? You need a hug." He belched out a throaty laugh. "You've caught me unprepared twice, Farnsworth," Johnny said. "There won't be a third time. Try again, and you'll get back worse than you gave." "Ooh, I'm shaking," he said, quivering his hands in mock fear. "I heard you're some kind of karate chopper. Well, I ain't no piece of wood. You try that stuff on me and you'll wind up with more than a black eye." "We'll see, won't we?" Johnny glared. "Yeah, we'll see," Laszlo retorted. At that point, Wilson walked up. "Fall down, Whitaker." "With Laszlo's help?" Johnny responded. Instead of coming to his aid like last time, Wilson just nodded. "You'd better keep your eyes open, I guess." He stepped over Johnny and entered the building. "See you around, Skeksis," Laszlo sneered, then walked toward the door, derivating his steps just enough to intentionally smash Johnny's hand along the way. Johnny couldn't keep from crying out of pain this time. "Wow, you're really clumsy," Laszlo taunted as he went inside. "Oh boy, I thought I told you to steer clear of him." It was lunchtime. Johnny was in Ben's workshop, nursing his bruised hand and cut knee and munching on an egg salad sandwich. Emmy had requested a different assignment and was working on costumes with Wilson. "I'm trying," he answered. "I'm gonna have to grow eyes on every side of my head. That buffoon comes out of nowhere." He took a sip of milk. "But never mind him. What about the bank alarm deal? Great, huh?" Ben stared at him. "You mean the deal you made without even consulting me about it first?" Johnny froze mid-bite. He lowered the sandwich. "Oh, I thought..." "Did you? Or were you just trying to be the big man again?" "No, honest!" Johnny explained. "I thought you'd be happy. And I really do think it will make the bank more secure." Ben's eyes narrowed. "From who?" "Them!" Johnny pointed to the newspaper on Ben's workbench. The headline blared, "Feds call for all-out war on crime's ring. Hoover seeks to crush gangs. Bank robbery syndicate believes compromised of hardened criminals screwed gang." Ben scanned the story. "We ain't had no trouble like that around here." "Not yet," Johnny replied. "But there's some shady characters around town." "Some? Okay, one." "And who's that?" Johnny sighed. "Have you run into Al yet?" Ben's brow furrowed. The fella what kept your face from getting busted by Laszlo? Yeah, I met him. I'm shook. his hand till it almost fell off. He chuckled. You think he's a bank robber? Did you talk to him? For a spell, he was real friendly. Went on and on about the folks in town, how nice everyone is. Asked about Sunday services, Christmas festivities, them sort of things. I invited him to come to a few so he could to meet the townsfolk. Hasn't his aunt already invited him? Ben blinked. Aunt? I don't recall him saying anything about no aunt. Johnny's antenna shot up straight again. He told me his aunt wanted to know about how safe the bank was. But if he doesn't have an aunt here, now, I never said he don't have an aunt. Just that he never mentioned her. Ben snapped his fingers. But come to think of it, he did ask about the bank. He wondered whether the police patrolled it. Sounded like he was thinking of depositing his own money there. His own money, though. Johnny held up his head. Come on, Ben! That doesn't sound suspicious. Could be. But you gotta be careful not to jump to conclusions. Sometimes the truth is hiding inside concealed places. A thinking man looks at a problem from every angle he can forward. The real picture comes into view. Johnny sighed. So, you don't want to do the alarm deal then? Ben scratched his chin. I didn't say that. I just want to be consulted about things that considered me same way as anybody else, especially when I'm not sure if I can do what you promised I can do. Johnny leaned in. Of course you can. You said he wants a button. I got a switch. You can make a button. And what about a signal to the sheriff's station? How we gonna do that? Easy. It's just a matter of... Johnny stopped. A smile curled on his lips. We? Well, I ain't doing this by myself. You committed me. You committed you, boy. Understand? Johnny jumped up. Absolutely, we just need to adapt the fire alarm into a proper demonstration unit for the bank alarm. That shouldn't be too hard. Ben nodded. All right. Let's come up with a list of supplies. Once rehearsal's over, we meet back down here and we'll get to work. Johnny grinned from ear to ear. You got it, partner. The rest of the day was planned. Once Johnny had finished rehearsals, he hightailed it down to Ben's workroom, and the two of them got started. Where you get these ideas, boy? He asked Johnny. Some of this stuff never even occurred to me. You got a real bright future, John. A real bright future. If I can stay out of trouble long enough, Johnny noted. Ben measured a length of wire and snickered. You know, I loved to read from time to time when I was little. My mama couldn't read, so I read to her. I used to say the reason I read so well was 'cause I didn't like chores. Ben snipped and stripped a wire, then turned to Johnny and grinned. She was right. Now here I am at this school doing chores. The good Lord used my laziness to teach me things I'm using right now. He nudged Johnny with his elbow. He gonna use you too. You wait and see if he don't. It took longer to assemble the demonstration unit than they thought it would. By the time they got to the bank, it closed. Johnny peeked in the window just to be sure Mr. Underwood wasn't still there, when a resonant voice from the street said, "Howdy!" Startled, Johnny spun around. The flashlight beams blinded him. "Bank's closed up for the night." It was Deputy Miller. His flashlight zigzagged from Johnny to Ben. What are y'all doing here?" Ben explained about the alarm system, and Johnny about his concerns for the bank's safety. "Alarm, eh?" the deputy mused. "And it'll be rigged up to the station?" "That's a right good idea." He winked at Johnny. "Worried about your gold, eh?" "Well, it's not mine. But, yeah, I'm worried about it. For a very specific reason." Johnny explained his thinking about Al. Deputy Miller nodded thoughtfully. "You don't need a fret none. I've met the man. He seems nice, and so far he's been a law-abiding citizen. Johnny started to respond, but the deputy cut him off. "Trust me, son, I'm on top of things. Now, if I were you two, I wouldn't be peeking in bank windows this late. Some folks might think you're looking to break in." With that, he tipped his hat, chuckled, and walked away, calling back, You both best begin on home." Johnny frowned, but Ben said, "He's right. We'll try this again tomorrow after school." "Okay." Johnny nodded. The two friends parted, each heading in opposite directions. Johnny went to bed without supper that night, punishment for coming home late. But as he lay in bed, he wondered why his punishment wasn't harsher. He came up with two reasons. First, his explanation for his laziness. It was nearly 6 when he had gotten home. His father had met him at the door with a stern lecture at ready. But when Johnny told him and Fiona about the alarm, Harold blinked in astonishment. "Mr. Underwood actually wants to see your demonstration?" "Yes, sir. We'd have shown it to him tonight, but we ran out of time." Despite his anger, Harold was clearly impressed. "And you think it'll work?" "Absolutely." Johnny nodded. "Ben's a great inventor. He's teaching me a lot. It'll work, all right?" Quite the son you have there, Mr. Whittaker," Fiona said with a smile, and that was the second reason Johnny wasn't grounded. Fiona's response. "Harold," she said, "the lad made a mistake, but don't expect him to be a man yet. Let him be a boy a while longer, and boys make mistakes." "Aren't you the one who says mistakes are the only way we can truly learn what's right?" And just like that, being grounded was off the table. What stuck with Johnny's mind was he felt his empty stomach growl. Was that Fiona's defense of him sounded remarkably like her old self. It had been almost 2 weeks since the accident, and a full week since she'd learned she'd probably be blind permanently. And yet she seemed to be coming to grips with it, as though she was finding a path through her new dark world. That worried him. Was she just denying her grief? Setting herself up for a big fall later? He wouldn't let that happen. He'd have the healing cloth back on Wednesday. Then he and his father would use it to regain her sight. and their troubles would be over. Chapter 12. The alarm demonstration the next afternoon was a great success. This is a milestone for the Barrymore Banking and Trust, Mr. Underwood pompously announced to his audience of two, his arms waving grandishly. Installing this alarm system procures measurements of technological security hitherto unaccomplished in our humble establishment. It is a bulwark of protection for the assets of our Burgos clientele. My thanks to you both. Johnny wondered if Underwood had swallowed a thesaurus. There we go. I can speak. While he left a sudden hunger for a dictionary. You're welcome, he said. He could tell Ben got a kick out of his speech, too, though all he said was, happy to be of help. Underwood's smiling face turned inquisitive. How long will the installation take, and when will you be able to do it? Oh, it shouldn't take more than a day, sir, Ben responded. We need to do it when nobody's here. Tomorrow being Saturday, Underwood said eagerly, the bank shall be closed. Would that work for you? You bet, Ben replied. We're all ready to go. Splendid, Underwood gushed. I shall see you here on the morrow. He shook their hands once more and walked back to his desk, murmuring, a milestone! Montementus! Ben and Johnny smiled at each other, packed up the alarm equipment, and headed outside. Johnny thrust his hands in the air. We did it! Well, we still gotta install it, Ben said with a smile. You think you can stay out of trouble till tomorrow? Johnny chuckled and threw up his hands. Who knows? Johnny and Ben met at the bank bright and early, their alarm system in tow. Mr. Underwood stayed with them for a couple of hours, excited and curious at first, but less as the morning wore on and the job became more mundane. Finally, he had had enough. I'll leave you two gentlemen to work. I left my telephone number on my desk if you need to call me. Otherwise, just make sure the front door is locked when you leave. Then, with a wink, he added, not that we have anything to worry about anymore, eh? He opened the door briskly. On the opposite side stood Emmy, her fist raised to knock. Ah, Miss Capello, Mr. Underwood greeted. Are you here to help with the installation of our alarm system? No, sir. I was wondering if I could talk to Johnny. Certainly, but not long. He is here on important business. He patted her on the shoulder, then launched himself onto the sidewalk, whistling as he went. Hi, Ben, she said as she entered. He gave her a wave and busily went about his work. Johnny was installing a panic button behind one of the teller windows as Emmy approached the counter. I went by your house. Your mom said you'd be here. This is impressive. Not yet, but it will be. There was a pause. He kept working, and she took a deep breath.
I came to tell you a couple of things. First, I'm sorry I was so touchy the other day. I can't even explain why. My mom thinks I'm going through a growth spurt. I don't know if that's a good excuse, but it's the only one I have.
Johnny couldn't suppress a mischievous grin. Why is it that you and I seem to be apologizing to each other so much lately? Emmy returned the smile.
Maybe because we're both growing up.
Oh, I hope not. Johnny said. What was the second thing?
I have good news about the play, Emmy replied excitedly. I talked to Principal Ambrose yesterday.
Did he agree to make the play a fundraiser for Steve? Johnny asked eagerly.
Well, he said he'd think about it, but he did agree to let us sell Steve's Christmas cards at the performance.
That'll help, Johnny said, stripping a wire. From across the room, Ben called over, If you two's settled things, I could use some help over here. Coming, Johnny called back. I'll let Steve know.
Okay, see you. And again, sorry. Bye, Ben.
Bye now.
Johnny and Ben worked tirelessly installing and testing the system. Finally, every door and window was secure. Johnny was especially proud of his magnetic sensors, which were virtually invisible to the untrained eye.
There's something really special, Ben said. You got yourself a keen mind, boy. You give me a run for my money.
The Whitakers stayed home from church again that Sunday. Even though Fiona's mood had improved greatly, she couldn't yet cope with the sympathies of the congregants, no matter how well-meaning they could be. After lunch, Johnny went to Steve's to tell him about the approval to sell his Christmas cards at the play. Steve had already drawn several additional designs. Johnny marveled at the detail of them.
You're the best artist I've ever known, Johnny said.
I mean it.
You've never met any other artists, have you? Stevie asked.
Well, no.
They both laughed. My dad's taking my sketches to the newspaper in Durham this week, Steve said. You should have the cards in plenty of time for the play, he awkwardly added. And thanks a lot. Sure, you up for another game of Don't Chip the Tooth? Steve grinned. Time you learned a new game. We should play Flick instead. Grab that deck of cards on the dresser. First person to flick 30 cards into my dad's hat, wins a piece of Mom's famous apple strudel.
It wasn't even close. Steve shared the strudel with him anyway. They were in the home stretch of rehearsals now. The performers used more costumes and props, and the sets, lighting, sound, and electrical effects worked great. There were still rough spots in the performances, but all in all, things were coming along nicely. It promised to be a bang-up event, the highlight of the Christmas season. As he brushed his teeth before bed Tuesday night, Johnny's mind wandered. He dared to hope that things in his life were finally getting better. The play was coming along well. He and Emmy were back to normal again. Laszlo had left him alone for the most part. Sure, there was still a mystery to solve surrounding Al, but Johnny liked mysteries. Best of all, Ari would be back tomorrow, and he'd get the cloth from her.
Fiona would be able to see him play Scrooge after all. By the time he snapped out of his reverie, he realized that he had been brushing his teeth for at least 10 minutes. He looked in the mirror to make sure he hadn't ground them into nubs. He climbed into bed and quickly drifted to sleep, little realizing just what joy and sorrow the next day would bring, and how they would change his life forever. Chapter 13. The next morning was cold, and Emmy had decided to go to school early to get some work done on the costumes, so he was alone again to keep his eyes peeled for Laszlo and Al. But he didn't see Al at all, and he didn't encounter Laszlo until he arrived in the cafeteria theater. The sets were in place, and Laszlo was getting a final fitting on his costume. He held a long wooden staff and wore a full-length robe with a large hood that hid his face. Although Laszlo's eyes were hidden, Johnny felt certain that the brute was watching him and sneering. The rest of the morning passed without incident, but the rehearsal after lunch began with the scene between Scrooge and the ghost of Christmas yet to come, him and Laszlo respectively. As with most rehearsals, they started, stopped, and restarted several times, as Mrs. Wagner giving notes and suggestions. Every time Mrs. Wagner looked away, Laszlo poked and jabbed Johnny with his pointy staff. Johnny tried to ignore him, but the more he did, the harder the pokes and jabs became. Things came to a head, literally, when Principal Ambrose walked in to consult with Mrs. Wagner. As soon as she turned to talk to him, Laszlo, who was standing behind him, raised the staff and brought the end down hard on Johnny's skull. A jolt of pain shot through and rang his ears. That was it. His patience and calm snapped. Before he could stop himself, Johnny wheeled, let out a karate yell, and lashed out with full force sidekick against the staff, snapping it in two, followed by a round kick directly to Laszlo's kneecap. The crack could be heard around the room. Laszlo screamed in surprise and pain, collapsed to the floor. "Whitaker!" Principal Ambrose barked. "What have you done?" "He hit me with a stick!" Johnny railed. "I think my leg's broken," he bellowed. "Serves you right," Johnny retorted. "You've been asking for it for days. I told you I wouldn't put up with it anymore." A collective silence fell over the room. Principal Ambrose bounded to the stage, thrust his arm, and pointed toward the door. "My office! Now!" "Just me?" Johnny objected. "Farnsworth gave me my black eye and tore up my knee yesterday, and just thwacked me over the head. I should be allowed to defend myself." The principal gritted his teeth. "I won't tell you again! Go!" Johnny turned to leave. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Wilson poking his head out from behind the backdrop, desperately trying to hide his laughter, avoiding everyone's gaze, especially Emmy's. Johnny stomped from the door. Principal Ambrose harangue lasted 35 minutes. Johnny's suspension lasted much longer. I cannot brook any fighting in school. You are suspended. Go home. We will see you back in school after Christmas break. Johnny's jaw gaped so wide you could throw a fish into it. But sir, what about my grades? And the play! I'm Scrooge! You were Scrooge. That honor will now fall to Mr. Knox. Principal Ambrose wagged his head. You disappoint me, Whitaker. The school needed you in that role. Your actions affect more people than you realize. A truth you'll have plenty of time to think about over the next several weeks. Stunned, Johnny wandered into the deserted hallway. In the sheen of the early afternoon sun, splayed through the corridor window, was Ben, his back to Johnny, bent over a bucket and wringing soapy water from a rag. Johnny thought about trying to skirt past him unnoticed until Ben said, So what's the verdict? You expelled? Johnny sighed. Suspended until after Christmas break. And I'm not in the play anymore. He swabbled at a particular grimy corner of the window pane. Son, you're a tough one to figure. 1 minute you're trying to save the world, the next you're fighting again. He stopped and sized him up. Which boy are you really? Johnny shrugged. The jury's out. Ben shook his head. I suppose that's true of lots of folks, but the sooner you get settled in, the happier you'll be. He swiped the rag for a clean cloth and began wiping the window dry. The saffron-tinted sunlight colored his rag and glistened in his eyes. So what are you going to do now? Johnny thought for a moment and then said brightly, Actually, I do have an errand to run. And then I think I'll stop by the bank and check on our alarm system. He took Ari's address from his pocket. Ben stuffed the cloth in his overalls and picked up a pail of soapy water. Best get moving then. He strolled down the hall without another word. Ari's home was situated a half a mile west of town on Cherry Tree Lane, an unpaved street lined with towering lobby-bobby pines. Their long, needled branches flocked with billowing tufts of snow. A black Chevrolet Eagle sedan was parked. Oh, that's probably Chevrolet then. Chevrolet Eagle sedan was parked beside the white clapboard house. Johnny faintly saw some movement through the thin curtains of the window pane. He jumped up the porch stairs to a time and knocked on the door. Ari opened it. Well, look what the cat dragged in. You're earlier than I expected. Shouldn't you be in school? Johnny shrugged. Not according to the principal. She chuckled. Getting into some trouble, did you? You are like my brother. I hope it's all right that I came early, Johnny said. Is the cloth ready? I've got another stop to make. No trouble, towel. Come on, I'll snag it. Johnny stamped his boots and walked inside. Ari crossed the front room and ducked around the corner. What's your next stop, if you don't mind my asking? She hollered as she went on. A friend and I installed an alarm system at the bank on Saturday, Johnny called back. I wanted to check in on it, just in case the guy from the diner gets any ideas. An alarm system, huh? She called from another room. Well, you must be a talented young man. It's mostly my partner's creation, he said, but I do like making things. She rounded the corner, holding a brown paper package in her hands. I wrapped your grandpa's cloth up for you. It's clean as a whistle. She handed it to him. John Lee wanted badly to open it, to make sure it wasn't some other worthless rag. Ari must have sensed as much. She said, You want to check to make sure? He nodded and tore it open. He would recognize the weave anywhere. It was definitely the healing cloth. He breathed deeply. His greatest fear was that he would find out it had been burned. Instead, it was safe in his possession. Thank you, ma'am, Johnny said. I appreciate you taking such good care of it. It means a lot to me. She smiled, exposing her crooked teeth. I can see that. She opened the door. Glad it worked out. Johnny stepped outside, bounded down the porch steps, and headed toward home. Stay warm now, Ari called to him and then shut the door. As far as Johnny could tell, the system was working perfectly. He discreetly checked the connections and headed toward the front door. Mr. Underwood was hard at work behind the desk. Instead of interrupting, Johnny waved and gave him a thumbs up. Mr. Underwood reciprocated. Johnny smiled and stepped out onto the sidewalk. He took a deep breath and headed down the street. Feeling quite optimistic despite being suspended from school and kicked out of the play, big fat flakes of snow began to fall. Johnny wished it were Christmas tonight. It must be, he mused. If the cloth worked for Fiona, it might be, he mused. If the cloth works for Fiona, that's better. He ran and slid across the icy sidewalk when a familiar voice from behind startled him. Well, if it isn't young John Whitaker. Professor Mangle held a paper bag from Coleman's grocers. His hat was pulled down, shading his eyes. Johnny couldn't tell whether the man was pleased or upset to see him. Hi, Professor, Johnny said. Shopping? Picking up a few things, Mangle said, his voice flat and expressionless. Awkward was the word that came instantly to Johnny's mind. So, Mangle continued, you offered to sell Stephen's Christmas cards at your school play, eh? Johnny nodded. To raise funds to help pay for his medical bills. Yes, very kind. Mangle eyed Johnny's knapsack as though he knew its contents. In spite of the bitter cold, Johnny's hands turned clammy. Well, I better get home. Tell Steve and Paul I'll come by soon, if that's okay. Mangle's hat bobbed slightly. Nervous, Johnny turned and stepped into the road. Mangle grabbed his arm and jerked him back harshly. In such moments, time stops. In the course of a second, a dozen thoughts, feelings, and terrors can thrust themselves into the psyche. Johnny feared that Mangle was about to harm him. The look in his eyes peered from under his brim that was laced with rage. Johnny yanked his arm free and was about to call for help. Then he heard a car horn blare, the tires of a vehicle squeal as it swerved to miss him. Watch where you're going, boy! Mangle barked. The realization that Professor Mangle had just kept him from being struck by a car slowly seeped into Johnny's senses. Thank you, sir, he said, catching his breath. I wasn't paying attention. Obviously! Mangle straightened up. He heaved a sigh. Are you all right? Yes, I could have been killed. Through steely eyes, Mangle said coldly, Acting nicht. I think not. Johnny's mind fogged over. What do you mean? A car going that fast? You know what I mean, Mangle interrupted. Then he leaned in so close that Johnny thought the man might take a bite out of him. You have it, don't you? Johnny's stomach fell to his feet. Have what? The cloak in his knapsack suddenly felt like it had gained 20 pounds. Mangle's menacing eyes scanned Johnny, looking for the way inside his mind. How is Benjamin Huck? He said, recovering from his gunshot wound. Johnny's eardrums pulsed, and his body rocked with every thumping beat of his heart. He's fine. He doesn't think he was shot after all. Mangle spoke quickly. Not shot? And yet, all that blood. Mangle gazed, peering through Johnny. I hope it didn't ruin your Shaw. Johnny's eyes widened. He had no idea what to say. Fortunately, he didn't have to say anything. At that moment, another car honked at him. This one pulled to the curb and the window rolled down. John? Harold called. Dad! Hop in. Hop in. Don't want you coming down with a cold. John eagerly complied. Care for a ride, Carl? Said Harold. Snow's coming down pretty hard. No, danke. Danke. I prefer walking. Mangle looked directly at Johnny. Guten Abend. As his father drove away, Johnny looked back. Mangle stood watching the snow settling on him as if he were a statue. Harold said, I was driving home from the store when I saw you. What were you doing out there? Johnny's heart was pounding. He didn't know where to start. John? What's the matter, son? Are you all right? Johnny took a deep breath, steadying breath. He decided he needed to come clean about everything. Remember when you said you were amazed at how much stuff happens to me in a single day? Well, today is no exception. I have a lot to tell you. Dad, some of it is really good, and some really not good. Harold's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Tell me the not good first. It's all kind of a blended together. The reason I was out there was because earlier this afternoon, I was at the bank checking on the alarm system. Harold nodded. I don't want you skipping school, but checking on your work is laudable. Johnny swallowed. Thanks, but I didn't exactly skip school. The reason I was able to get there so early in the afternoon was because I was suspended today until after Christmas break. He explained what happened at school, then braced himself for the lecture about his karate solely for self-defense and the responsibilities of a professor's son, and about being a good role model for others. But instead, Harold seemed surprisingly calm. Actually, this may be for the best. Johnny blinked. Why? Harold took a deep breath. I never got around to telling your mother about you being in the play. She's doing better, but not being able to see your performance might have set her back. Johnny sighed. Actually, she may have been able to see me. Harold's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Johnny's mind felt numb, his senses overwhelmed. I have the cloth. Harold nearly ran off the road. What? With you now? How? It's a long story, but I managed to track it down. Harold broke into a smile. That's phenomenal! Well done. I can't believe... Dad. He knows. Harold froze. What? Who? Blood drained from Johnny's already pale face. Professor Mangle. He knows I have the cloth. And I think he'll do whatever it takes to get it from us. Chapter 14. Harold parked the car a block from home and grilled Johnny about how he located the cloth and about his exchange with Mangle. When Johnny finished, Harold stroked his chin thoughtfully. I don't know, John. From what you've said, I believe Carl suspects. But I'm not convinced that he's certain we have it. I think instead he's just probing. He didn't come right out and accuse you of having it, but he would have if he knew for certain. You think he's baiting me? Johnny said. Yes. Johnny sighed. I was going to visit Steve again soon, but now I'm not so sure. I should. You have to, Harold stressed. Act like everything is normal. If you fall back now, he'll sniff out that he was right. I've known Carl long enough to recognize his strategy. But he had to see that I was scared. And what boy wouldn't be? It sounds like he was fairly intimidating. In fact, I'll call him on it when I return to work. He'd expect that as well. You think he was baiting you too? Johnny asked. Of course, Carl doesn't do anything without thinking it through from every angle. Harold started the car and turned the wipers on. In the few minutes they were parked, more than an inch of downy snow had accumulated on the windshield. He put the car in gear and pulled out the tires, slipping a bit until they gained traction. The knapsack containing the cloth rested on Johnny's lap. He held it tightly. He hoped more than anything that Fiona would get her sight back. He imagined how it would play out. He and his father would lay the cloth over her. His father would hold her hands and pray for her eyesight to be restored. The cloth would be lifted from Fiona's face. Her eyes would blink, then open wide. And then he imagined her joyfully jumping and hugging Harold, crying and exclaiming over and over, I can see! Thank you, John Avery! Thank you, John Avery! Thank you! Can I see it? Harold asked, pulling Johnny out of his daydream. They were parked in their driveway. Johnny nodded. He opened the knapsack and pulled the package from it. He gently unwrapped the paper and lifted the cloth and held it up to his father. Harold touched it, more as if he were collecting data than admiring a piece of history. Do you think we should see if it'll help Fiona? Johnny asked. Harold peered at Johnny. I wish you'd call her your mother.
Aww.
Johnny said nothing. Harold laid his hand over the cloth. This time it seemed with reverence. Yes, we should try. Harold intentionally stroked less coal in the boiler than usual. He told Johnny he wanted the house a bit cool, expecting that Fiona would ask for a cover to keep warm. Of course, they would have just the thing waiting. After dinner, the family sat in the living room for the reading of the Bible. Every year, they read the entire book of Genesis to Revelation, 2 or 3 pages per night. Johnny wished they could forget it tonight and get to the urgent matter, the healing cloth. But Harold wanted everything to continue as usual. Harold read first, the book of Ephesians. After a few pages, he passed the book to Johnny. From verse 18, he said. Johnny reluctantly took the book and read, "Be filled with the Spirit, speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord, giving thanks always for all the things unto God and the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ." He stopped. "Keep going, John Avery," Fiona said. "Do I really have to read this?" "You didn't finish the chapter yet, lad." "I just don't want to read it anymore." "Why not?" Harold said. "I just don't." Harold's voice sharpened. "John, this is the word of God. You may not like it, but in this house, you will always respect it." Fiona's tender voice countered. "Harold, no need to swat a fly with a sledgehammer." Charlie's eyes got big. "Can you do that, Daddy?" "It's a metaphor, Charlie," Harold responded. "What's a metaphor?" Charlotte asked. A metaphor's a silly way to explain something," Fiona answered. "It's like saying, my hands are ice." "But your hands aren't made of ice, Mommy." "That's right, dearest, but they are quite cold." "Would you care for a blanket?" Harold offered. "No, I may just go to bed. I've got a splitting headache." "Is that a metaphor too?" "No, dear. It's a idiom. And it's a fact." Fiona rose and ornated herself toward the bedroom. Johnny expected his father to say something to stop her, but her decision seemed to have him unprepared as well. Finally, as she began walking away, Johnny blurted out, "But you can't go to bed yet!" Fiona turned, her eyes aimed in his general direction. "Oh, and why not?" Before Johnny could think of an excuse, Charlie chimed in. "We haven't prayed yet, Mommy. We always pray after we read the Bible." "That's right," Johnny agreed. "I'll get you a blanket." "No, I'm fine. You 3 can pray without me tonight. I'm certain the Lord will answer. Understand?" Johnny's mind spun around like a roulette wheel. He hoped it would land on a way to change her mind. "It's not the same without you," he said. "Please, just a few minutes. Then you can go to bed." Fiona looks flummoxed. "You don't want to read the good book, but you want to pray? When have you ever given a whit about praying?" What difference does it make? Harold asked. He wants to now. Don't look a gift horse in the mouth, dear.
Is a gift horse another metaphor, Daddy?
Actually, that's more of a proverb, Charlie.
I don't remember that being in the Bible.
She said, her nose wrinkling up in confusion. I'll explain later. Harold took Fiona by the hand and led her back to her chair. Get your mother the blanket, John. A blanket, John.
I'll get one.
No, I've already got one, Johnny blurted out. He took the healing cloth, which he had placed under his chair before supper, and unfolded it carefully. Something felt different about it. He didn't know what at first, but did when he held it up to lay it over Fiona. It wasn't as long as it had been. A fairly large piece had been cut from it. Who cut the cloth? Will it have any effect on its properties? Before Johnny could fully panic, Harold took hold of one end of the cloth, lifting it up so they could cover Fiona completely. Harold's brow furrowed, suddenly questioning Johnny's concern. Johnny ignored the gesture, and they laid the garment over Fiona, covering her up to the neck. Johnny wished he could lay a part of it directly on Fiona's eyes, but they couldn't do that without giving away their scheme. Charlie said,
Where did you get that blanket? It looks old.
Leave it to Charlie to say the worst possible thing at the worst possible time. You're such a blabbermouth. Johnny snapped at her. John Avery! Fiona said with equal parts scalding and questioning. She felt the cloth. This isn't a blanket. It's some sort of linen. Where did you get this, John? Harold took the lead. What difference does it make? Took the lead. What difference does it make? Let's pray so you can get to bed. Everyone bow your heads. Hold on a minute, Harold, she said. What are you boys up to? Up to? Harold said. We just want to... Fiona cut him off. Don't finish that sentence until every ounce of untruth is wrung from it. It's a bold sinner who would mix a lie into a prayer. Johnny said nothing more. Charlie, run up to bed, Harold insisted. I'll tuck you in after a little bit. Your brother and I need to talk about something with Mommy.
But we were gonna pray,
she said. I'll pray with you when I tuck you in. Go, now. Go on now.
Yes, Daddy.
She got up and padded away up the stairs and down the long hallway to her room. Dad, are you sure we should? Johnny whispered. He nodded. I'm sure. He softly responded. I can hear you both, you know, Fiona said. The ear bone's not connected to the eye bone. Now fess up. What's going on? Harold took Fiona's hand. What I'm about to tell you will be difficult to believe, but I need you to listen with an open mind. He memorized everything he knew about the journal and the cloth. What he didn't know or had forgotten to mention, Johnny filled in. Summarized, not memorized, summarized. There are other pieces I'm trying to put together now, Harold explained. I can't say for certain that this is the same cloth, but my father-in-law felt sure. At least, that's what he noted in his journal. Fiona sat quietly for a moment, thinking. So, why have you laid it on me? If it is that cloth, it should be locked away or in the museum. Fiona, this cloth has been associated with healing people. No one needs healing more than you. No, Harold. Johnny watched in disbelief as she pulled off the cloth. No? What do you mean, no? Harold asked incredulously. I mean, the Lord knows better than we do what we need. It's taken me these past weeks to understand that I cannot say that I don't miss seeing the sunrise in the morning or the dear faces of my family. But I won't presume to tell the Lord that He got it wrong when I hit that tree. I won't tempt Him, not even for my sight. As she spoke, she folded the cloth and held it out for someone to take. Johnny took it, though his heart sank. Don't you think God can heal you? Of course I do, child, but I don't think He needs a piece of cloth to do it. Harold countered. The biblical narrative does provide examples where He did that very thing. The woman who touched the hem of Jesus' garments for once. Yes, and handkerchiefs and aprons that touched the Apostle Paul were taken to the sick and they were cured. I know it did happen, she responded. Then why not try it now? Johnny asked. I've already prayed for healing, John. Many times. And the Lord has seen fit to keep my eyes closed. Harold squeezed her hand. One more prayer. Wouldn't hurt, would it? But Fiona's mind was made up. Don't try that. Tack on me. Of course another prayer wouldn't hurt. But using the cloth would. It could hurt a great deal. Where does our faith lie if we trust a thing more than God? This is thin ice you're walking on. Besides, if it does somehow possess power to heal, God knows why. What would happen if an unscrupulous person got hold of it? Johnny and Harold locked eyes. They couldn't argue at this point, since they both had worried about Professor Mangle's seeming obsession with obtaining it. You don't even know what it truly is, or where it came from, she continued. Imagine that it would heal me. Word would get out about me, especially in a small town like this. Someone would try to take it, and in the hands of fallen men, an item of that power would do more harm than good. It's like Plato's ring of kindness. The power it gives is too strong for anyone to handle. No, I want no part of it. I hope Johnny had been storing inside. The hope that Johnny had been storing inside, that Fiona might get her sight back, melted away like a cloud driven by a buffeting wind. Don't you want to see again? He asked softly. Fiona reached out her hand, searching for his face. When she found it, she tenderly stroked his cheek. I see you in my memories and in my heart. I'll never forget those pictures. Harold looked shattered. Johnny slowly rose. As he did, the cloth slid from his lap onto the floor. The mixture of anger, frustration, disappointment, and feelings he couldn't put names to well up within him. He clenched his jaw and ran up to his room, fell on his bed and wept bitterly. Johnny heard a soft on his door. That wouldn't be his father. He always gave one sharp knock for barging in. A gentle voice on the other side. "John Avery, may I come in?" Johnny sat up and wiped the tears on his face. "Yes." The door opened and Fiona walked in. "I've brought you your blanket." "Thanks," he said. She handed it to him and he tossed it onto the lid of the trunk. Fiona's head turned left then right, hands on her hips. She declares, "My, but this room is a mess." "No, it isn't," he retorted. I cleaned it this morning." Fiona laughed and clapped her hands in appreciation of the joke. Johnny couldn't help being amused, even though he said, "That wasn't very funny." "It wasn't, eh? Then why you smiling?" Johnny puzzled. "How do you know I'm smiling?" "A smile isn't just something you see, it's also something you can hear." "Although I haven't been hearing too many out of you lately." "I haven't had much reason," Johnny said, the smile all but gone. "Oh, is that a fact? May I ask you, what do you have to be unhappy about?" Johnny wanted to look at her now but couldn't. Every time he saw her eyes glaring off vacantly into space, acknowledging that she would never see again, made the world a bit darker for him as well. I'm waiting, she prod. I'll never be truly happy again because of what happened to you." It's not a dirty word, John. You can say it." "No, I can't. My blindness is my burden, isn't it? Why should it make you so unhappy?" "I always pestered you about going riding, and I loved doing it with you. It's not as if you were making me do something I didn't wanna do." Johnny fidgeted, wondering what to say, how much to say. But now you can't ride anymore, and you can't do lots of things you used to do." "Well, I don't know about that," Fiona mused. "But even if that were true, it's still my concern and not yours." She sat down beside him on the bed and held out her hand. Johnny placed his hands on hers. She gripped them tightly. "Am I right?" Words. How to use the words to describe feelings. He wished he could turn on a spigot and let all his feelings flow straight from his mind to hers. But like Grandpa used to say, you can't use tools you don't have. "John Avery," Fiona pressed, "tell me the truth. Why are you unhappy, lad?" Johnny searched deep into his mind for the answers that even he hadn't understood. Before he could put the pieces together, the words came out. Because you aren't!" The answer seemed to surprise Fiona as much as it had him. "What? I don't understand." "You remember before the accident how I told you that you didn't know how I felt about my mother because you never lost anything?" "I recall something about that. I don't remember everything we discussed. That day is a bit hazy for me." "See, that's what I mean. You lost something that day. Something really important. And you're still not unhappy." No, I guess I'm not. I was, but not anymore. That's been replaced with peace. She scooted close to him and put her arm around his shoulders, leaning her head down close to his. She said, "That makes you angry, doesn't it?" "Yes!" His emotion freely burst out from him now. Before he could stop them, tears welled up in his eyes and spilled over onto his cheeks. Fiona held him close. He hadn't felt that loved or protected since his mother died. The thought of his mother's hand stroking his hair, the stories she told him at bedtime, her silly faces that made him laugh, the times he curled up on her lap, all those memories and dozens more heaped one on top of another. He didn't think he would ever feel happy again when she died. He cried for the memories he had and the ones he had forgotten. All the while, Fiona rocked him back and forth. She didn't tell him to stop. Somehow, she seemed to know how those tears were and how long they had been waiting to carry his feelings to the surface. Johnny couldn't say how long that went on. What he did, though, was that even with all those tears, he still felt an ache that needed its own healing. "Fiona?" "Yes, child?" "How can you be happy all the time?" "Well, in the first place, I'm not always happy. I still get upset, as you well know. But when that happens, you know what I do?" Johnny shook his head. He instantly felt silly because she couldn't see him doing it. He was about to say no, what? Before he could, she answered, "I remember an old Scottish prayer that my mum taught me when I was a little girl. Lord, I've thanked thee 1,000 times for the roses, but never once for my thorn. Teach me the glory of the cross. Teach me the value of the thorn. Show me that I have climbed to thee by the path of my pain. Show me that my tears have made rainbows. Amen." Johnny contemplated the idea of being thankful for difficult times. It made no sense to him. "You see, John Avery, everything has a purpose, even the bad things. We need to stop thinking about ourselves and look up." "Knowing that makes you happy?" Johnny asked. "Yes, that's part of it." He thought for a moment, then asked, "What's the rest of it?" Fiona smiled. "Lad, you know the rest, whether you realize it or not. It's right in front of you. You read from it every single night." "The Bible?" "Yes. It's like God's journal, and He allows me to read it anytime." Johnny hadn't considered the Bible that way before. "But I read it too." "Aye, but you read it with your head, not your heart. You have to read it with both, to listen and try to understand what the words are saying. And who's saying them?" Johnny remembered his grandfather's journal. He treasured that gift, even though he couldn't understand much of it. That it was given to him specifically made him feel special, loved. He hadn't considered that the same could be true of the Bible. "I've never, at least not in a long time, trusted God. Not since my mom and grandpa died." The faintest hint of sadness flashed across Fiona's face.
It's hard to lose the people we love. I know that. We're all going to die someday, and you know what? I'm glad of it. I won't want to live in this world forever. I'm looking forward to the world to come.
Every time he thought about heaven, Johnny chalked it up to nothing more than a silly sentimental notion, a thing people said they believed, but never thought through rationally. Do you really believe there's a heaven hiding somewhere in the universe? Fiona's eyes, unable to see anything in this world, almost seemed to look straight into the next. I don't know where 'tis, lad, but yes, I do believe. Believing makes me a peace and joy that's unexplainable and beyond understanding. It'd be easier for me if I could see it. Would it? A Scottish man once said, "Seeing is not believing. It's only seeing." I understand that even better these days. But how can you believe after what happened to you? Fiona's face grew strong. My blindness, John. You can say the word. Actually, he couldn't. I've discovered that losing my sight, although it was difficult at first, has brought me even closer to God. Closer? How? Fiona smiled sweetly. Young John, always searching for answers. In this case, you won't find one that measures up to what you want to hear. It's that peace I mentioned, which passes all understanding. It's not part of an equation or a scientific theory. It's bigger than that. The concept eluded Johnny. But if he's really God, he made all of this. How can it be bigger? You made something a few years ago. What was it? A biometer? To tell the weather by? I knew the snowstorm was coming because of it. Did it tell you why it's snowing? Sure, the pressure changes when... No, I don't mean what's the cause it to change. I mean, why is it snowing? Do we need extra moisture for some reason? What's the purpose of it? No one knows that. Ah, there is one who does know. Science only takes us so far. After that is God. Johnny had no argument to that counter. It's hard for me to think that way. Science makes sense because there are laws that determine how the world works. Religion means shutting off your mind and just believing it through. It doesn't make sense. Fiona searched for Johnny's hand and finding it, held it tight. Johnny, I cannot see whether you're beside me, but I know you are. I hear your voice, but I dunno for certain that it's your hand I'm holding. There's no one else in this room with us, Johnny countered. Oh, I cannot be sure of that. My eyes don't show me whether it's true or not. Well, I'm telling you there isn't. And I believe you. I take your word for it because I trust you. She put her arm around him. It's no different with God, laddie. He's proven himself to me over and over. I take his word on faith too. And though I cannot see him
I know he exists. I talk to him just like I'm talking to you. And though my ears cannot hear him, my soul hears him.
In that moment, Johnny loved Fiona as much as he had ever loved his mother. He remembered Janice talking to God that way too. And he remembered the dream, the one that came late in the night when sleep was so thick you couldn't wake from it. In particular, he recalled a moment that he'd never realized before. His grandfather and his mother were praying fervently over him. He was just a child, and he was crying. How could he recall a detail from when he was so little? He remembered feeling something he couldn't describe, something there's no word for, and laughter, and his mother scooping him up and carrying him while she laughed. And he felt something else too, something there is a word for: peace. He hadn't felt that in a long time. He wanted to feel it again. I can't hear God's voice, Johnny said, tears welling up in his eyes. No, lad, you can hear it. You just don't realize it. It's him talking. How do I do that? Johnny asked, tears spilling down his cheeks again. Fiona held him tightly. Favorite quote of mine is from a wise man by the name of G.K. Chesterton. He wrote that there are two ways of getting home. The first way is to stay there. The other way is to walk around the whole world till we come back to the same place. It's like that with God. I've known him since I was a wee bairn, and I've stayed with him all my years. Other people search and search, trying and believing everything, but him. Eventually finding themselves in front of him anyways. When we put our trust in him, that's when we can hear his voice. It's such a sweet voice, lad. I don't know how to get there, though, Johnny said. Fiona squeezed him tightly. Jesus is the way. For all of us. What does he tell us to do? Find our way to him? Repent of our sins. Turn to God. Have faith. Then we receive the gift of eternal life. This world cannot give us joy because true joy doesn't exist without gold. Johnny wiped the tears from his face. He took a deep breath and inhaled more than air. He breathed in hope. This is what he wanted. It's what he guessed he always wanted. Will you help me do that? He said. Johnny saw tears coming down Fiona's face now, glad tears that channeled over her cheeks onto her laugh lines and down to her huge smile. Oh, John Avery, of course I will. She held his hand. Are you ready? Johnny felt a little uncertain, not knowing how this would change his life, and yet truly knowing that he would never be the same. Happily resigned, he said, I'm ready. As Fiona prayed with him, Johnny felt the weight of carrying his own struggles being lifted and replaced with incomprehensible peace. For the first night in a long while, Johnny fell into a completely deep, restful sleep. Draping over his grandfather's trunk was the old piece of cloth, a cloth he decided before he drifted off that he would have to eventually destroy. Chapter 15. The next morning, Johnny woke up early and couldn't get back to sleep. He thought about the events of the day before and then the ones to come. Once his brain engaged, there was no turning it off. Instead of wanting for the sun to rise, he decided to occupy his time productively. First, he tucked the cloth into his trunk and locked it. He leaned out of his bedroom window and checked the biometer. He put it in his knapsack to take another reading at the river. He decided to find out whether there would be a difference near the water, and if there was, extrapolate how that would affect weather patterns in the area. Then he came downstairs, Macduff trailing at his heels. His father was at the table reading his paper. Johnny secured his father's approval for his expedition. Then he grabbed a flashlight, and he and Macduff made their way to the river. They arrived as day began to break. The river was a solitary space where a young boy could lose himself. In stillness of the morning, somehow everything seemed more vibrant and alive today. The cold air hung thick over the water in patches of fog. The weather felt damp and seemed to dim every color but a tenuous powdery blue. The water was bitterly cold, though not cold enough to freeze, other than the sections tucked away from the current. As Macduff explored the surrounding terrain, Johnny pulled the biometer from his knapsack and set it down beside the water. Several large flakes had appeared in the storm glass. He sat on a nearby rock to wait, allowing time for it to adjust to its new location. Upstream, a log jam derived what water it couldn't hold back. Johnny saw a beaver swimming toward it with a branch in its mouth, one end freshly chewed. He breathed deeply. This place made the cares of life evaporate, and for that he treasured visiting it whenever he could. Then he realized it wasn't this place at all, but who was at this place with him that made it worth treasuring. Just yesterday, he hadn't been able to understand the joy of God's company. He marveled at how different his life had been mere 24 hours later. He heard a branch snap on the other side of the river, and looking up, expected to see another industrious beaver at work. Instead, beside a sapling evergreen tree stood the mysterious boy he had seen months ago by the old Granville house. Johnny jumped up, and the boy smiled and waved. Johnny smiled and waved back. He motioned for the boy to join him, though he wasn't sure how, since the nearest bridge was a quarter of a mile up the stream. The boy seemed to consider it, then looked over his right shoulder, startled, and took off down the path, the river disappearing into the snow-covered forest. Seconds later, Winslow and Laszlo appeared, chasing after the boy, their arms filled with snowballs. They launched in his direction. They too disappeared into the tangle of branches, laughing as they went. Macduff barked earnestly, darting back and forth along the riverbank. Johnny's instinct was to get across and help the boy, but the three boys ran in the opposite direction from the bridge. He'd never catch up. He called out for Winslow and Laszlo to knock it off and get back to school. But his voice was swallowed up in a loud flow of current. Three things occurred to him. First, he wondered again who this mystery boy was. Johnny had never seen him in Brookhaven, so he assumed he went to Durkham. But if that was so, why wouldn't he already be on his way there? Classes would be starting soon. Second, though Laszlo limped a bit, he hadn't been seriously injured by Johnny's karate kick after all. Third, Winslow just confirmed that he and Laszlo weren't adversaries, but rather in cahoots. Wilson had certainly set up the first confrontation so that he could appear brave and courageous in front of Emmy. Pathetic. I couldn't try swimming if I were you. I wouldn't try swimming if I were you, a voice called out. As if she knew he was thinking about her, Emmy appeared out of nowhere. Macduff scampered over to her. She bent down and patted his head. Did you see those two? Johnny asked. Emmy's expression suggested a question mark. No, who? Wilson and Laszlo were chasing the Phantom Boy. I saw at the water tower. Emmy's question mark morphed into a disgusted exclamation point. I'd hope Wilson had changed. I guess not. Is the boy okay? I don't know. He had a head start. A thought occurred. How did you know I was here? And shouldn't you and Laszlo and Wilson all be at school rehearsing? She walked up to him. I stopped by your house. Your dad told me you were out. Since you were suspended, Principal Ambrose and Mrs. Wagner needed time to regroup and gave us all the morning off. We're supposed to go back this afternoon. So, I take it Laszlo was suspended? Emmy shook her head. No, it's not fair. But I'm glad you whomped him. He had it coming. Johnny nodded. Yes, he did. I am sorry for you, though. Me? Why? Since I can't play Scrooge, my understudy will have to do it. And my understudy is... Emmy turned pale. Wilson Knox. Yup, the guy who chases defenseless kids. He's got the Scrooge part down. But I don't think any number of ghosts could convince him to change his ways. Well, I guess we'll have to make do, Emmy muttered. He won't be anywhere near good as you, but... Well, you saw his audition. Wilson may be a twit, but he can act. Johnny exhaled warm air onto his cold hands, then impishly asked, So, are you gonna kiss him? Emmy's face instantly screwed up in disgust. Yuck! Never! Johnny laughed.